The poorest state in America is richer than nearly almost every country in Europe. There's this chart that's going viral right now that shows GDP per capita of the richest and poorest US states compared to G7 countries. And the numbers are pretty staggering. Mississippi, the poorest state in America, has a higher GDP per capita than the UK, France, Italy, and Japan. West Virginia, the second poorest state, beats all of them, plus Canada and Germany. People are losing their minds over this. One guy tweeted, "Euro poor is an entirely accurate phrase. America is simply in a different league." Someone else said, quote, "Don't come at me with free healthcare. You pay for it with absurd taxes." But then the other side showed up with their own charts and data. And honestly, once you dig into this, it gets way more complicated and more interesting than either side is admitting. So let's talk about that. So first of all, the GDP per capita numbers on that chart are real. That's not made up. Those are real numbers from the IMF and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. But here's where it starts to fall apart a little. The first issue is purchasing power. You have to account for exchange rates and the fact that a dollar doesn't buy the same amount of stuff in every country. When you adjust for what money actually buys, what economists call purchasing power parity, the picture changes dramatically. Germany goes from around $53,000 on the viral chart to more than $73,000 when you adjust. So Mississippi goes from neck and neck with Germany to $14,000 behind it. And the UK, France, and Italy all jump ahead of Mississippi also. That brings us to the second issue, and it's a big one. That's the difference between mean and median. GDP per capita is an average. You take total economic output and divide by the number of people. The problem with that is the US has significantly higher income inequality than most European countries. Billionaires in the tech sector and Wall Street pull that average way up. When you look at what the median person or the person in the middle actually takes home, the picture changes. The US still leads most of Europe on median disposable income, but the gap is much smaller than the GDP numbers would have you believe. And some estimates suggest that once you subtract out-of-pocket healthcare and education costs, things that Europe largely gets through taxes, the gap between America and Europe narrows even further, and in some cases it disappears entirely. Then there's a third issue, which is hours worked. Americans work a lot more than Europeans. The average worker in Mississippi puts in 1,820 hours per year. In Germany, it's 1,355. So the person in Mississippi is working 36% more, and over a lifetime, that's almost 25,000 hours more. At the same time, they live almost 10 years less on average. Life expectancy in Mississippi is 70.9 years. In Germany, it's 80.5 years. So you're working significantly more hours over your life and dying a decade sooner. GDP per capita doesn't capture any of that. That brings us to another important topic, which is healthcare. The US spends roughly $14,900 per year per person on healthcare, more than double what European countries spend. And despite that, a significant share of Americans report skipping or delaying getting medical care because of costs. Now, people on the American side will point out that US healthcare quality, for those who can access it, is the best in the world. You have shorter wait times for specialists and cutting-edge treatments. And that's true, but it's a system that works great if you have insurance, but not so great if you don't. Europeans get a different trade-off. Universal access, longer wait times in some cases, but virtually nobody goes bankrupt from medical bills. Another point worth mentioning, and this is important, is Europe isn't one thing. The GDP per capita for Italy is 38,000, but for parts of northern Italy, it's as high as 60,000. While for southern Italy, it's as low as 21,000. It's basically two different countries. Same thing with Germany, the western part versus the eastern part. Same thing with the UK. So comparing a single US state to entire countries in Europe hides a lot of variation on both sides. Now, having said all of that, the people making the America are richer argument aren't wrong either. The US does produce more economic output per person than Europe, and that gap has been widening, not narrowing. The US dominates in tech, biotech, financial markets, the top end of innovation. Europe has no companies that compete with Apple, Nvidia, or Google. The best European talent in tech and finance frequently moves to the US because that's where the opportunity and compensation is. So the raw economic engine of the US is genuinely more powerful. But the honest answer to the question of whether Americans or Europeans in general are richer depends entirely on what you're measuring and who you're talking about. If you're a high earner, the US is probably the best place on the planet to be. You get lower taxes, higher salaries, and more upside. If you're a median earner, it's much closer to a wash, and maybe some parts of northern Europe come out ahead. So is Mississippi richer than the UK? By one specific measure, yes. But is the average person in Mississippi living a better life than the average person in the UK? That is a much harder question to answer. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments and follow for more insights on the economy and investing.